Beneath every marquee light, there was a shadow no press release could touch. In the golden age of Hollywood, the world's most desired men and women lived double lives, loving in secret, marrying for cover, building careers on smiles that hid heartbreak. Some carried the truth to their graves. Others, decades later, finally let the world see them whole. Tonight, we open the locked doors of the studio system and step inside the real lives behind the legends, starting with the man whose secret nearly brought an empire to its knees. Actor 1 Rock Hudson. Picture a movie palace in 1955. The lights dim, the newsreel fades, and then he fills the screen, 6'4", a jaw carved for close-ups, a voice like polished mahogany rolling through the speakers. Seats squeaked as women leaned forward. Rock Hudson wasn't just Universal's leading man. He was their dream made flesh, engineered for desire from the ground up. But strip away the marquee name, and you find Roy Fitzgerald, a man who went home each night to a door with 2 locks. Studio fixer Henry Wilson had built Rock from scratch, the walk, the posture, even the arranged girlfriends, who were, in truth, secretaries assigned to keep suspicion at bay. When the tabloid Confidential threatened to blow the illusion apart in 1955, Wilson didn't hesitate. He staged a whirlwind wedding to Phyllis Gates almost overnight, and the scandal machine went quiet. But quiet isn't the same as gone. At his Malibu house, the guest list flipped after midnight, gossip photographers filed out, and in their place came a looser, freer crowd, handsome surfers and friends who let Rock shed the marble statue persona and just laugh in cut-off jeans. Elizabeth Taylor, who adored him, once said he flirted better than any leading lady she ever worked with. "Made me laugh, I loved him." And their famous pillow talk friendship gave Hudson a rare space to voice anxieties few men dared speak aloud in Eisenhower's America. Then came 1984, and the diagnosis that changed everything: AIDS. The revelation shattered Hollywood's polite fictions overnight. The industry's most bankable, most virile leading man was gay, and instead of the scandal Henry Wilson had spent decades preventing, the world responded with something closer to grief and sympathy. It became one of the pivotal moments that forced America to look directly at the epidemic it had been trying to ignore. What lingers, decades later, is a line biographers keep returning to, something Rock reportedly scribbled in the margin of a script. "I won't apologize for living the life that lets me breathe." For an actor built entirely on He-Man bravado, the real drama of his life was never on camera. It was the simple, dangerous act of daring to exhale. His story set the pattern for so many who came after him, actors trapped behind studio-built facades, desperate for the same permission to breathe. One of them was murdered outside his own apartment. Another built an empire disguised as friendship. We start with the most famous name in the story, but the most shocking one is still ahead. Actor 2 Ramon Novarro. Step into a 1920s movie palace, velvet curtains, jazz trills drifting from the orchestra pit, and on every poster, the soulful eyes of Ramon Novarro promising exotic, forbidden passion. MGM sold him as the Latin lover, the man who could seduce an audience without ever touching them. It worked. He became, for a time, the heir apparent to Rudolph Valentino's box office throne. Off-camera, the Mexican-born star lived a much quieter life. Dinners with composer Leano Barrymore, soirees where Cole Porter played piano late into the night. But MGM chief Louis B. Mayer was terrified that any hint of scandal might dethrone his new leading man, so he assigned Novarro bodyguards that functioned less like protection and more like surveillance. Novarro, ever clever, deflected arranged dates by citing his devotion to Catholic prayer. "My only mistress is the rosary," he reportedly told one pushy columnist. His friend Tallulah Bankhead wasn't buying it. "Rosaries don't stroll hand in hand along Santa Monica Pier at midnight, darling," she teased. For decades, that was the whole story, a star hiding behind piety and studio muscle. Then, in 1968, it turned into tragedy. 2 brothers, having heard rumors that Novarro kept large sums of cash hidden in a silver goblet in his home, broke in and beat him to death. The tabloids screamed. Hollywood wept. It was a brutal, senseless end for a man who had spent his whole career performing safety while living, quietly, without it. And yet, historians who later read through Novarro's private diaries found something unexpected: gratitude, not bitterness. If fame was camouflage, his own writing suggests, it was camouflage that still let him kiss beautiful men beneath the moon. His chariot races on screen thundered with spectacle, but it's the whispered, moonlit kisses recorded in his private pages that echo loudest through silent film history today. Novarro's murder is one of the darkest chapters in this story, but he wasn't the only young star whose secret life ended in sudden, public violence. Decades later, on a February night in West Hollywood, history would repeat itself with chilling precision. Actor 3 Sal Mineo. He burst onto screens as Plato, the fragile, devoted friend and rebel without a cause, and the heartbreak on his face wasn't just acting. Off camera, Sal Mineo carried a real crush on his co-star James Dean, one he confided to his own diary. "He looks at me and I forget my lines." Warner Brothers publicity did what studios always did: arranged double dates with Natalie Wood, plastered them across fan magazines, kept the illusion alive. Mineo played along, though he later joked that he and Natalie spent every one of those stage drives talking about how handsome Jimmy was. As the 1960s arrived, the boyish idol who had made his name playing tender, wounded teenagers found there was nowhere left for that persona to go. He never fit the era's hardening demand for macho leading men. So he pivoted, deliberately, toward theater and edgier, more honest work, taking the role of an openly gay prison inmate in Fortune and Men's Eyes. Critics praised his courage. Hollywood, typically, shrugged and moved on. Mineo kept trying to finance independent passion projects, some drawn directly from gay literature, fighting for stories the mainstream industry wouldn't touch. Then, on a February night in 1976, walking home from rehearsal, Sal Mineo was stabbed to death outside his West Hollywood apartment. Police initially suspected a hate crime targeting a known gay man. The truth, when it emerged, was almost stranger. His killer turned out to be a mugger with no idea who Mineo even was. The randomness of it only deepened the tragedy. Today, fans remember him not as a victim but as a pioneer, a young actor who turned rumor and private longing into open, deliberate art, years before it was safe, let alone fashionable, to do so. His death cemented his place as Hollywood's eternal lost boy. But he was far from the only leading man whose private torment quietly reshaped his art. One of his contemporaries poured that same hidden ache into performances so raw they're still studied today. Actor 4 Montgomery Clift. Monty Clift arrived in Hollywood like a blast of Manhattan theater grit, brooding eyes, method acting intensity, cheekbones sharp enough to slice chiffon. Directors adored him instantly. Studios were far less comfortable. Clift politely declined fan club luncheons, dodged reporters' questions about girlfriends, and instead spent his weekends hosting jazz jam sessions with playwright Arthur Lawrence and a rotating circle of handsome photographers. His closest ally through it all was Elizabeth Taylor, who became something like an unofficial beard and a genuine confidant at once. She called him Bessie May, and the two of them traded gossip and cigarettes at 3 in the morning like old friends who'd seen through every studio game together. During the making of From Here to Eternity, handlers tried repeatedly to steer Monty toward every available starlet on the lot. He sidestepped it all with practiced, easy southern charm. Then, in 1956, a car crash shattered his face, and in a much quieter way, it shattered the fragile concealment he'd maintained for years. As painkillers and public speculation swirled through the headlines, friends whispered a harder, sadder truth: that Monty believed his hidden life had crippled him long before he ever got behind the wheel that night. And yet, on screen, that private ache became his art. He poured every ounce of it into performances that still feel almost unbearably alive decades later. After his death in 1966, a magazine finally printed an essay he had drafted years earlier but never published. A single line that reads like the blueprint of his entire soul. "The saddest thing I know is loving quietly. The happiest, too." Clift turned concealment into some of the most haunting acting of his generation. But not every star of that era hid so completely. Some built entire double lives out in the open, disguised as nothing more than close male friendship. One of the most magnetic and mysterious of them all never let anyone pin down the truth, even after his death. Actor 5 James Dean. He hurtled across movie screens and open highways alike, dazzling, dangerous, and gone almost as fast as he arrived. Of everyone in this story, James Dean's sexuality remains Hollywood's loudest open question, a mystery the decades have never fully resolved. Before fame found him, Dean reportedly spent time with radio director Rogers Brackett, a relationship that blurred the line between mentorship and something more. Gossip writer Joe Hyams claimed Dean once confessed to bisexuality during a drunken New York evening, punctuating the admission with a line that could double as his epitaph. "Why should I care what people think? I'm not going to live forever." On the Warner lot, Dean filled his off-hours racing motorcycles with stuntman Bill Hickman and slipping into a repertory theater where male dancers rehearse barefoot, sometimes joining in himself, always citing research as his excuse. Whether it was genuine interest, calculated image control, or simple curiosity, no one can say for certain. Publicly, he dated actress Pier Angeli, and studio publicists pushed the narrative of an epic romance hard, right up until tabloid photographers caught him brooding outside her wedding to another man. Friends recall Dean's own dry verdict on the whole affair. "Maybe Pier loved Jimmy the Myth, not Jimmy the Mess." Then, at 24, a Porsche crash froze every myth about him permanently in place. Among his belongings, a safety deposit box was later found to contain poems signed only with male initials, and a photograph of Dean kissing an unidentified man backstage. A friend, perhaps. Perhaps something more. No one has ever definitively said which. What survives isn't an answer. It's mystique, the legend of a rebel who refused every label the world tried to hand him, choosing instead to live, in his own words, fast. Not every star of the era got to remain a mystery, though. Some had their private lives paraded in public the moment scandal came knocking, and one all-American blonde boy learned that lesson the hardest way, at the very top of his career. Actor 6 Tab Hunter. He looked like he'd stepped straight off the cover of a 1950s high school yearbook. Varsity blonde hair, a shy grin, cheeks dusted with a kind of perpetual summer glow. Warner Brothers milked that wholesome image relentlessly, right up until the night police raided a Hollywood party where male dancers were present, and Tab Hunter was caught inside it. Agents rushed him out through a back fence, but not fast enough. Paparazzi snapped photos of the hem of his Letterman jacket, and gossip columnists began circling like they'd smelled blood. Studio boss Jack Warner had a solution ready-made: manufacture a very public, very photogenic romance with Natalie Wood. Tab dutifully escorted her to the Coconut Grove night after night, smiling so hard his jaw ached. She later joked, only half kidding, that she'd earned overtime pay for the performance. Behind the scenes, though, Hunter was falling for someone else entirely, his Psycho co-star Anthony Perkins. The two of them roller-skated at midnight around Paramount's backlit, trading scripts and secret love letters, then climbing out of separate cab doors on opposite sides of a block just to avoid being seen leaving together. It would take Hunter half a century to tell that story publicly. His 2005 memoir, Tab Hunter Confidential, finally revealed the roller skates, the panic attacks, and one particularly delicious detail: a pet horse named Harlow that, as Hunter put it, never cared who I kissed. Critics called the book the sunniest coming-out story Tinseltown had ever produced. Hunter had waited decades to finally wave to the world as himself, and when he did, he rode off, at last, into the open air. His secret partner in all of it, though, carried a far heavier burden of concealment, and paid a far steeper price for it. His story is next, and it's darker than anyone in Hollywood at the time realized. Actor 7 Anthony Perkins. He's frozen forever in the public imagination as Norman Bates, thin frame, awkward smile, unmistakable mother issues. But the scariest force in Anthony Perkins's real life wasn't fictional. It was Universal's own publicity machine. Shy and intellectual by nature, Perkins spent his off hours in New York coffee shops practicing French verbs and sketching costume ideas. A private, gentle life almost nobody associated with his unsettling screen persona. Broadway director Joshua Logan introduced him to Tab Hunter at a beach party, and something clicked instantly between them. They traded monologues, went horseback riding together, fell for each other completely. But the romance couldn't survive Hollywood's rumor mill. Perkins's own agent warned him plainly that even a whisper of scandal would reduce him to summer stock wages for the rest of his career. So Tony became a master of the heterosexual photo op. Staged lunches with Audrey Hepburn, hand-holding premieres alongside actress Victoria Principal, all while meeting men on discreet walks through Central Park. Ironically, Alfred Hitchcock actually encouraged the illusion, telling reporters, "Perkins never brings girls to set. He stays in character." Years later, Tony married photographer Barry Berenson, a genuine, gentle union that gave him 2 sons and finally, some room to breathe. But his private journals, leaked after his death, confessed something the marriage never fully erased. He still dreamed, even years later, of Tab's surfer laugh. When Perkins died of AIDS in 1992, Hollywood was forced to reckon with the truth quietly, sorrowfully. The boy next door had spent his whole life inside a house of locked doors, not unlike the Bates Motel that made him famous. His story runs in parallel with another silent-era leading man who used a very different weapon against the studio system. Instead of hiding, he simply refused to lie. Actor 8 William Haynes. Billy Haynes was the wisecracking king of 1920s romantic comedy. Think a Ryan Reynolds figure with wilder socks and an even sharper tongue. But his real legacy is something bigger. He delivered Hollywood's very first open, deliberate defiance of the closet. Billy's true love was ex-sailor Jimmy Shields, and the two of them lived together openly in a Mediterranean-style bungalow they nicknamed the Gay White House. When the tabloid Confidential threatened to expose him, MGM chief Louis B. Mayer demanded the standard fix, a lavender marriage to some conveniently arranged actress. Billy just smirked, tapped the ash off his cigarette, and said flatly, he was already married, to the man waiting for him at home. The studio doors slammed shut on his acting career almost immediately. Haynes shrugged it off and reinvented himself entirely as an interior designer. He and Jimmy went on to transform Joan Crawford's mansion into an Art Deco jewel, remodel Ronald Reagan's Pacific Palisades retreat, and effectively invent the California casual design aesthetic that still defines the look today. Crawford, a lifelong friend, called them the happiest married couple in Hollywood. Even violence couldn't break them. When anti-gay attackers targeted their home in 1936, Billy and Jimmy fought back with garden hoses and dry wit. Columnist Luella Parsons quipped that the attackers left wetter than Billy's martinis. Haynes never made another film, but at his funeral in 1973, Joan Crawford held Jimmy's hand and whispered 5 words that captured the whole story. "You two beat the system." In an industry built on secrets, Billy Haynes chased the shadows away with nothing but a paintbrush and a punchline. Not every star had that kind of freedom, though. Some carried their double lives inside marriages that lasted decades, hidden behind a legendary Hollywood grin. Actor 9 Cary Grant. He had the grin of a Cheshire cat who'd read everyone's secrets, and quietly written half of them himself. Born Archie Leach, Cary Grant shared a Santa Monica Beach house with fellow actor Randolph Scott for most of the 1930s. Gossip columns dubbed it Bachelor Hall, and printed photos of the two men in matching aprons grilling steaks together like it was the most normal thing in the world. Studio executives were far less amused. When columnist Hedda Hopper pressed Grant about his wedding plans, he fired back, "Who says I'm not married to Randolph?" Hopper printed the quip, then quietly sanitized it by adding, "In the business sense," to soften the implication. To further dilute suspicion, Paramount engineered romances for him with Carole Lombard and later Barbara Hutton, whom he eventually did marry. And yet, even through 5 marriages over the decades, Grant held on to his lifelong friendship with Randolph Scott. His ex-wives reportedly joked that their real rival wasn't another woman at all. It was a lanky cowboy who kept turning up in the guest room. Grant himself seemed to enjoy the ambiguity as much as anyone. "Everyone wants to be Cary Grant," he once quipped. "Even I want to be Cary Grant." A sly acknowledgement of just how carefully constructed his public persona really was. He died in 1986 without ever publicly labeling himself one way or another. But letters exchanged with Scott, uncovered afterward, are full of private jokes about our cottage hideout, and reference a shared cocktail recipe the two of them had named "Two Bachelors in Love." Hollywood still debates exactly what the relationship was, but the letters alone suggest a bond deeper than anything either man ever put on screen. Grant built his entire career on charm and misdirection. But not every actor of his generation had a mentor willing to sacrifice them to protect someone else's secret, and one rising star paid the price for exactly that kind of betrayal. Actor 10 George Nader. George Nader belonged to the golden galaxy of 1950s beefcake leading men, square jaw, bright smile, and a startlingly gentle manner underneath the muscle. Universal groomed him to be the next Rock Hudson. In fact, the two men shared the very same agent, Henry Wilson, a man who specialized in shepherding handsome, closeted talent through the studio system. When Confidential magazine threatened to expose Rock Hudson, Wilson reportedly made a cold, calculated trade, sacrificing Nader by handing the press an unfounded rumor about him instead, deflecting attention away from his bigger star. The studio quietly froze Nader out afterward, sliding him into B Pictures and eventually German science fiction television, where the tabloids simply weren't paying attention anymore. Through all of it, Nader lived openly with his lifelong partner, Mark Miller, and their Doberman, Arno, hosting Sunday brunches famous around town for bottomless sangria and quiet, knowing jokes about Hollywood's blacklists. In 1978, he channeled the whole experience into fiction, writing Chrome, a pulpy science fiction novel built around two male lovers, arguably the first sci-fi bestseller to feature an openly gay romance at its center. Asked if he feared backlash, Nader just grinned. "I've already lost one career to rumors. Why not gain a new one with truth?" Cult cinema fans today remember him as a genuine pioneer, proof that it was possible to climb out of the studio reject pile and into a place as a queer literary trailblazer, armed with nothing but courage, a typewriter, and apparently, an endless supply of sangria. Nader survived being used as someone else's sacrifice. Another leading man of the era built his entire public image around swashbuckling romance with women, while quietly living a very different truth behind closed doors, right up until his sudden death on a film set. Actor 11 Tyrone Power. Tyrone Power swashbuckled his way through the 1930s in The Mark of Zorro, fencing villains and fluttering eyelashes with equal precision. Publicists crowned him Hollywood's handsomest man, conveniently forgetting to mention his equally close friendships with some of Broadway's handsomest men. Power's wartime service in the Marines put him alongside male companions who shared foxholes, private jokes, and, according to letters he sent home, a kind of coded, deeply felt longing. After the war, rumors linked him to actor Cesar Romero. Columnists noted that the two men vacationed together in Havana with no ladies in sight, and speculated pointedly that they must be fishing. 20th Century Fox, predictably, panicked, engineering a marriage first to French actress Annabella, and later to Debbie and Menardos. Even Annabella herself admitted that Power's favorite pastime was staying up late into the night over cognac, deep in conversation with his male friends. Tragedy struck in 1958, when Power collapsed of a heart attack while sword-fighting George Sanders on set and died shortly after. Among his personal effects, investigators found a leather diary noting the birthdays of his closest male friends, and a pressed gardenia reportedly from Cesar Romero's hillside home. Whether the men in his life were lovers, wartime comrades, or something that never fit neatly into either category, Tyrone Power's off-screen charisma seems, by every account, to have matched the same swashbuckling intensity he brought to the screen. Not every leading man of his era got to hide behind adventure films, though. One poster boy of the World War II era had his entire off-screen life engineered by the studio itself, down to the wife he was told to marry.